All right. Um, I thought this was a very good debate. I enjoyed it a lot. I think that there is some difficulty in being able to make a decision in this debate, and I think the difficulty comes down is that both sides are sort of very locked into talking about their own side of the story, and not a lot of interaction with the other side. Like, there's not a lot of discussion about how talking about ableism will be able to solve for people who are deported. There's not a lot of conversation about talking about deportation being able to solve for ableism. It ends up being very much sort of like, we took into account ableism, we have to put the focus on deportation in the way that legal versus illegal bodies are talked about. And then you're like, well, they ignore ableism, we have this focus on ableism, right? Neither team is really making the we solve for the other argument very strongly, and both of you are making the you don't solve for our argument strongly, right? And so it becomes very difficult about that because neither of you are really making a root cause claim. I don't think that the debate needs to have root cause claims, but more analysis on that. And so the negative almost gets there where on like the permutation debate you say, I think in the 1 hour, we could solve for them, but not the other way around. But it's like there's not really any analysis there, right? And then the closest you all get is like, well, we've thought about these things. We put some things, crossed out some words and stuff like that. And, that could have been fleshed out more. Like, read some evidence by, like, Spivak or stuff like that about putting things under erasure, about how that is a transgressive act that's able to radically change things, right? If you did that erasure, don't just make it a no link. That's like a solvency argument. There's tons of evidence out there that erasure is what allows for a radical reconfiguration of these things and stuff like that. And that makes not only the permutation much stronger, but then also gives you a unique solvency avenue to solving for the types of isms that they're pointing out that they wouldn't be able to get access for as well, versus just like, well, you said dreaming and that's going to be ableist too, and you said this word. Like, if you could then team that up with and we did this erasure, is going to be a lot more powerful in that regards. And so I think that's what's missing on both sides, is sort of the interaction for how you solve the other story. And at the same time, neither of you are saying that you have a bigger impact, which I guess is good, right? Because you don't want to say that one population is more important than the other population or whatnot. But it also is like, if there's no impact that's bigger and there is no analysis of how one solves the other one, it's really sort of like, it becomes very difficult to make the decision because both of you are talking about very important things, both of you are talking about it very persuasively, and it's a question of sort of like, what ends up happening. So if this was an elimination round, I'd be pretty certain that it'd end up being a split decision based upon who sort of like bought what analysis one way or the other. Those things being said, I vote negative in this debate, and I think that a lot of the reasons come to the 1AR not going directly to the case page, where there's a bunch of a specific link analysis that's done there. The biggest stuff that I think ends up getting to me is where some of the 2AC arguments that says, well, you didn't talk about narratives, or you didn't talk about the ways in which in order to create the empathy, in order to do that creates apathy, and they're like, no, the fact that there's only a prescribed way for us to have to talk about it. You ignore the fact that we are also disabled, but we don't identify this way. You ignore the fact that I can't convey these emotions. You ignore those sort of arguments. Like, when the 1AR doesn't get to those portions of it, it becomes very difficult for me to get at some of the 2AR responses where you are responding to those sort of arguments, being like, we're not just saying that you weren't emotional enough or you weren't doing it in the right way, but how you don't go that next step. And I think if those arguments in the 1AR, the link levels that are being spun on the case debate wouldn't have as much traction as me. And it's not that the 1AR was bad. I think the 1AR was good in everything that you did. It was just not on. It just wasn't responsive to where I think some of the more persuasive links were, which was on that case page. And not to say that the 1R links were unpersuasive, but the 1R links were just sort of like, here's a word you used, here's a word you used, here's a word you used, and the 2NC was like, this is how it implicates us. This is what's going on here. And I think that the way that both teams sort of set up this debate, that is very much about sort of like how it affects the people within this room, and then also how is that going to carry out and affect people outside the room, which means that if you're not paying attention to the implications of things that were said that was offensive or turned into sort of ableist discourse for the way that they're related in the round, that becomes a situation where within the context of this room I can see things that are being created and being done that recreates sort of an ableist worldview to it. And I think that once you get the 2NC to admit that dreaming can't be done once deported, I think the 1AR should that be the debate, right? And that wasn't really the debate in the 1AR. It became more in the 2AR, but even the 2AR is not as big on that as possible. Like, you're not like, in cross-X, he says point blank, I guess not, right? And that's damning, and I don't think you should make that admission, right? You could dream about a world absent ableism regardless of what side of the border you're on, especially if the border is, as they're saying, an illusion, which means you're being deported to whatever place you're being deported to is just an illusionary construct, so there's no reason why you can't dream. And your alternative card is talking about things like transnational, ableist communities that are working across borders and things like that. So the card is very much talking about how it could be constructed, but you just sort of like concede that at that point. But I don't think that the affirmative, you get the necessary mileage in order that you got from that concession, which is a great concession that you're able to come the 2NC. And so once I think that what takes place within the debate round and becomes ableist, I think it becomes difficult for me to figure out a reason why voting affirmative that would recreate these other forms of oppressive hierarchies. Why should I place one population over the other? And I think that if there's more work done about why focuses on disability as a primary identity to focus on would be able to preclude other forms of identity that, the illegal identity, I think that would be important. The reason why that becomes important is some of the arguments that they're making about that the focus on legalization or criticizing the meta-narrative of legalization ignores in the fact how legalization creates a situation of where we're already assuming an abled versus like disabled body or who is able enough in order to be able to get access to these things. And you should go the next step by being like, the illegal is posed as disabled within these communities, and you sort of get there at points where you're talking about like blacks were denied the ability to immigrate because they were feeble-minded and stuff like that, but you should talk about it in relation to people who made that crossing and then were deported because they didn't offer this stuff, right? They weren't good illegal migrant workers who were then able to work on the farm and then not get noticed about it, right? They were bad illegal immigrants, right? And that constructed there, and that would be a good example of where you could then explain how what you're doing solves for the case. But with that level of leak analysis, it then becomes a question of like, if your counter narrative is one that is countering the narrative of legalization, and that narrative, the way that you're countering of that narrative recreates a form of ableist discourse because of the way that they are an activist in a particular way that you think is important, in the debate, then your counter narrative is not one that is large enough to disrupt those overriding structures that allow for ableism and that sort of violence to be able to be perpetuated. And so I think that what you could do is when they make the link argument how legalization is always already about the abled body, right? That means that your counter narrative on legalization is always already about the disabled body, right? And so that way when you talk about your mom, right, she was disabled because of the language barriers that took place that made it impossible for her to understand what the document was given. And society didn't give her the translator necessary so that way she could have the ability to understand what takes place, which is a form of ability privilege that was not operative, right? And so then you could utilize their legalization link story as a reason for why you would be able to solve it in relation to the narrative that's being talked about, for your mom, and talk about language as a form of ability privilege or disability privilege and things like that. And I think that would then be a clear story about how what you're doing would be able to gain access to the stuff they're talking about, so that way you could gain solvency for the affirmative. Opposed to just sort of being a permutation, hey, we could do it too. It's a we did actively do it. In fact, you say we actively do it when you say the legalization narrative is about this because we are criticizing the way people are included or excluded. We shouldn't have to say the word disabled in order for us to be able to talk about these things with meaning and with importance and stuff along those lines. And I think that would be a very persuasive way about going about how you create that form of inclusion. And I think that makes it much easier for me to see how I could vote affirmative, especially if it's like there's only a couple of links that are being addressed, I think, fairly well by you throughout the majority of the debate. Then it becomes like, well, if there's some links, but you're able to overarchingly get at that alternative, I think that'll be, I think that would help me to be able to vote for you in that regards. And I think that the Holocaust stuff that you go for a lot in cross-examination, it becomes like a footnote in your speech. I think that either like it should be there in the 2AC and be an argument, or just let it go. For sure. Right? And it's like, I don't know if you want, I don't think you're definitely not going the Holocaust trivialization route. You're going sort of the Holocaust, like, over-spectacularization route, right? Mm-hmm. And that could be a really good argument, that it only matters because it causes genocide. It only matters because it causes the Holocaust. It doesn't matter when you can't get to the bathroom because that's not genocide, right? But that's a form of ableism that happens time and time again when all the bathroom doors have is like kick plates where you have to just ram your wheelchair into it hard enough in order to get through, opposed to an actual button that can help open it, right? But that's not genocide. That's not as cause it, right? And they don't care about it if it doesn't cause genocide. And at the point that you have read that evidence, just go for it, right? Just be like, yeah, it does cause genocide. It is talking about the Holocaust because that is one of the times where the link was directly made. And while we're not saying you all are genocidal, we're saying that the discourses that we're pointing out is what allows genocide to take place. It'll allow for these discriminations to take place. So that way, when and if physician-assisted suicide is legalized, people could be exterminated in mass, right? And it's already legalized in a couple of states already, right? So then you can make those sort of analysis and distinctions, right? So if you're going to read it, don't go on the defensive when somebody starts questioning you on it. Be willing to defend. Yes, it's what caused the Holocaust.
yes, it's what caused other forms of genocide, and yes, if we continue this legacy, it will be genocide. And then I have an impact that could be weighed versus the affirmative, but you back off your impact card, and then it's like, well, I've got ableism, and then I've got illegality in, different populations, which becomes very sort of difficult to sort of, weigh out, because I don't think either of those populations are more important than the other population. And so, doing that would be beneficial, or making that a bigger portion of your argument would be beneficial as well. And I do think that, you do a good job of pointing out sort of like, they said this, these are not just like discursive links, but it sort of frame the reality about the way they take place. But you should also watch some of your word choices, because you do things you do use ableist language as well, like when you talk about dropping arguments and things like that, because they can't hold on to the sort of arguments that you're running through. And there's, literature that indicates that dropping as a metaphor is problematic as well. And so it's like, and pointing those things out when they're doing that, and you do that with dreaming, that begins to cut back against that. And then you could frame the debate better as like, at the point that we both link to utilizing ableist discourse, the tipping point is who is able to better create an imagination that'll be able to cut against the way that legalization takes place, right? And so it's like, you point out that they might be ableist in some sense, but then you don't implicate that argument of what should I do with that then. It's like, if you link more to ableism, but they still link, well, how should I evaluate the debate? That means I should vote for you because you're the only ones who gain access to the question of legal versus illegality, whereas where they're just in a question of ableism. And that becomes then, if that analysis is made, then it'd be like, okay, even if the 1AR didn't answer some of the things that, ignored the way that they were being constructed, doesn't matter, because if they both link to ableism, then becomes an easier way to go beyond that as well. And the last thing that I say is that I think that it would be useful when you're indicting the alternative to actually pull lines out of the alternative card that backs up your story. Because like when I read it, like I don't necessarily get a lot of what you're saying. Like when you did, it was either, I forget if it was the 2AC or the 1AR. One of you did it comes from thinking disability studies, and then and I like that, because then it's like, oh, this is about thinking. It isn't just about that. It's about bringing it into the academy and stuff like that. And so that was the one point where you do that, but you're really just referring to the article title, right? Refer to lines in there as well, because there's parts that talk about like the risk of being in academia and how we have to not allow this radical intersectional politics to subsume everything. And so you could, so there's some things in the card that seem to be opposite to your interpretation of it, but there are other lines in the card that I can see in line with your interpretation of it. And so that's one of the things that I think that could help out if your only real offense against their position, because there isn't much in this debate, is their alternative is problematic because dreaming isn't enough. You need to really explain and implicate that card in there. And I think that when you're prepping for the 2AR, that's one of the things that the 1A could do, is pull out the lines in this card that I could use to make those arguments. But I would also say that strategy-wise, your 2AC needs a greater diversification of offense against the position. And so, when I think about the major critiques that exist, it's like cap, anthro, ableism, race, right? Those are going to be the things that you're seeing again and again, and queerness is also in there. So it's like those 5 positions, you need to have a structured offense that has a diversity of things in there. And there's a bunch of people who write against not just ableism within the academy, but the ableism as a form of study, because it necessarily assumes it recreates a binary of able versus disabled and stuff like that. And there are people who are indicting that sort of stuff. You mentioned both Zach Richter and Walbring in your speech, and Richter writes articles criticizing Walbring. And so the Journal of Critical Animal Studies has an article by Zach Richter who's criticizing Gregor Walbring within it, and based upon the way that he talks about ability privilege. And Walbring is one of the major authors that people read in ableism, so you could grab that Richter article and utilize that in response of it. Because just like every other academic field, people write in response to one another. And so if you get those cards, it's going to be able to create a bigger diversification of offense. So that way it's not just your primary strategy is, we're not that bad, we do a bunch of good stuff, their alternative is problematic, right? Obviously I'm simplifying the things that you're saying, but there's no unique reason for why they should be rejected independent from the offense you're creating against their alternative. And if you're going to sit on that, you need to do more work at sort of pulling out those lines to do that. But I think that you could get that evidence out there on ableism, right? If you just pull a camp file, there's at least cards that do that. Most of those camp file cards are not great, but it gives you a starting point, because most camp files pick the right articles but not the right cards in the article. So you can then grab the right cards from that. And I think that would make it much easier, because then they have to answer stuff that justifies the foundation of their theoretical principles. Without doing that, the debate becomes much simpler for them. And so I think that would be beneficial. I also think that in the 1 and C, it did not seem like the argument applied. right? Because I did not immediately as like mobility metaphor. What mobility metaphor they have?
Yeah.
They're talking about literal, concrete instances of deportation, and then it's not to the block that all these links, develop. And sure, constructive speeches, you're allowed to do that sort of stuff, but I think that you can make a better one on C that has the links apparent. Like if you've already pulled out all of those links, I don't know at what point in the debate you did that, but if you've pulled them out, put them in the one on C, or have the case debate be not just the you have an embedded double turn, or you have a contradiction. Also be like, and here's a bunch of different links that you have down there, so that way the case page becomes your link story debate, and then the rest of the other piece of paper becomes the rest of the debate. So that way it's immediately applicable, opposed to here's at the end of the one on C, I think it's going to be a starting point debate, and it's not actually what it becomes, but I think that after the one on C, that's sort of how it's set off, and I think that you could have done it in other ways. All right. Any questions? No. Okay.
Question.
Yes.
Just trying to think about what it is real quick. So the way that we posit the citizenship thing, right, is like a starting point, it's kind of debate about where the topic shouldn't begin.
Mm-hmm.
So in our last round, I kind of fell into the same trap of like where the functionality of these meta narratives comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering how you evaluate it, the use of meta narratives, if you felt that they were functionally counter narratives, or if there needs to be more in the 1AC that really delves into what the counter narrative of the law is.
I think that you do a good job of explaining how you're a counter narrative to the meta narrative, the way that legalization and illegality works and operates through deportation. I think that part's clear, and so this debate, I'm not voting against you because your counter narrative doesn't solve for the things that you're talking about, right? It's more that your counter narrative has ableist tendencies within it. So I think that you're doing a very good job of sort of being like, this is the dominant narrative, and here's the stories that aren't getting heard. Here's the stories about people who are being, pushed, out, are rendered invisible and can't have these stories, and these counter narratives create disruption. I also think that you're doing a good job of explaining how the counter narratives in the debate space allows for it to be able to formulate activism both in debate and outside of debate and things like that. And obviously that's going to open you up to criticisms of viewing debate as activism, so hopefully you have blocks to that. But I think that that's where you really shine, as sort of on the meta narrative and versus counter narrative debate. I think that talking about the importance of narratives holistically and the narratives that are constructed would be beneficial, and I think that it would be good if you address the best version of the argument of the other team. So assume that they are a counter narrative. Now explain why that counter narrative is not as powerful of a counter narrative, or assume that they're a counter narrative, and why does that counter narrative not get at the questions of that you say need to be gotten at and things like that, right? Versus just sort of being you can't do our stuff.
Right.
Assume that there is an argument there somewhere that they can, and answer that version of the argument, right? And you two seem pretty smart, so I bet you could figure out reasons for why they would say that they would solve, even though they don't in this debate. And if you do that, then that would be better. So that way, it's not just because they aren't a meta narrative. I still see them sort of being a counter narrative to that society, but it is a different counter narrative. So now attack that counter narrative as not being as being as beneficial or whatnot, and not through because it creates apathy or emotion or things like that, because that's what ends up creating that link story, but sort of about what does it mean to foreground certain identities such as ableism versus what you're foregrounding is not necessarily an identity, because it's not necessarily any one particular race or any one particular type of body. It's anyone can be criminalized or not criminalized based upon the ways in which they exist and the ways in which they migrate and things like that. Whereas the negative seems to be creating an identity of the disabled body versus an identity versus the abled body. And sure, you're doing some sort of legal versus illegal body construction, but that's less of you're not positing a singularized identity, because the one I see is talking about specific individuals who've been deported, like your mother, like yourself, who are put at this crossroads and things like that. And then you're talking about your existences within community. So you're not positing essential identities, whereas the negative is sort of doing that, which is the criticism of disability studies that I pointed out about how it recreates that binary between abled versus disabled. That's that piece of offense that you could then point at from the way that they're creating essential identity constructions. You're not, and you're allowed to deconstruct that. And how many people, because of the way they think, schizophrenics and stuff like that, end up in jail or end up being stigmatized and things along those lines, because their mentality constructs them as being illegal, right? And so that becomes something that you can then utilize for how you're able to solve for their implications, because legal versus illegality is actually the underwriting current for what props up to make ableism uniquely violent.
Okay.
I have one question. What did you think about making apathy or objectivity an offensive argument? like, I think I try to hedge that, especially when it comes to the alternative, because I felt like just dreaming about it left the point about the questions of illegality, the dualism between illegality and legality very confused.
I think one, I don't think that they're just like dreaming about it, right? In the way that you're characterizing dreaming about it. So it's like that's why I need you to pull out those lines for why it's dreaming, because they are doing contextualization. Be like, we're not just talking about dreaming, like have a nice nap and think of some pretty things. They're talking about something a lot more than that. But I think that second, I think that I would not necessarily have predicted that they would be like, hey, we don't have connections to these emotions that you can't necessarily assume that. So I wouldn't say that you should never make the apathy arguments, because I think that generally they're good, that if their alternative can inspire people to actually want to make change, then it's not an alternative that will ever be able to do things. And I think that in a lot of debates that would be the case, and that would be fine. I think that what the two of you did was really intelligent in terms of being able to flip that back around and be like, how dare you say that I'm not emotional enough, I don't care enough, and things like that, right? It's like saying that they created apathy because they couldn't inspire people, right? That was essentially the link that I end up voting on, because they're like, I have done everything I can. That's just because I can't have access to this form of communication because of how I've been autistic, is exactly the problem, is because you're making me have to communicate within this abled form of language. So in this debate, it ends up, hurting you, because that becomes a link that I vote on. But in most debates, I think that's a good argument. If the alternative can inspire people to change, but you can inspire people to change, I would vote for the alternative that would be able to inspire change. So maybe in ableism debates, you should find different words than apathy. Like if you talk about like just inspiring change, that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't emotional enough, or they were just apathetic towards these things, or paralyzed, or anything like that. It means that the types of actions that were taken by them was not enough to actually do anything outside of just become an academic argument. And so I think that if you made those arguments and then pointed to the cards where that parts of the cards do that, then that would be a full, complete argument that I can see myself voting on, is that they did not cause the action to actually be able to produce the change, regardless of if they're apathetic or not apathetic. Okay. Yep. Any other questions or anything? No. Okay. Thanks for debating.